How did you go about finding that balance for the incredible tenants you now have and those customers who make up the composite of your building?
I think the answer to the question actually is it flows from Cape Town's kind of unique appeal as a place that attracts interesting people from around the continent and the world.
Hello and welcome to the Real Good Podcast by Neighbor Good, a podcast designed for the next generation of property entrepreneurs and investors, where our guests share with us their stories, their strategies, and their tactics about all things entrepreneurship and property investment related. My name is Murray Clark, and I'm your host. And today we have with us an extra special guest, Tim Harris. Tim Harris was the CEO of Wesgro. He operates at the intersection of politics, business, and entrepreneurship. He sits on the board of the CCID and is a member of the YPO. Tim is someone who shares so much valuable insights into the city of Cape Town, his career in both politics and entrepreneurship, and shares so much insightful thoughts and observations. Stay tuned and enjoy. Tim, welcome to the Real Good Property Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure for us to have you today. You're someone with a career that is operated at the intersection of property, politics, and business, and we're super excited to have you. Tell our audience a little bit about you as a human, where you came from, and just some of the aspirations that drive you today and what you're doing. You now you're the chair of the SA Tourism Board. You are obviously the head of Wesgro, which is the Western Cape's primary investment driver, which is super exciting. You sit on the YPO. So you're someone who has a lot of aspirations. You're a driven individual. I'm just excited for you to tell our audience a little bit about you as a human and what's driving you.
Yeah, so like you, I come from Durban. And I think we connected on the Central City Improvement District Board, which in itself is an interesting structure because it's one of the main drivers of the sort of multi-decade resurgence of the CBD. But I think the way I got there over the years was, as you said, from Durban as well. I moved here in 1998 to come to UCT, and I never really left. After I graduated, I spent a year in Joburg working for an investment bank, but ended up coming back to UCT to do my master's in economics. And after that, kind of ended up in politics without any great intention to be political. I was offered a contract to work on some economic policy when I was finishing off my master's at UCT. But the bug bit, it's political life is very addictive for certain personalities. This idea that you are at the forefront of the national debate, that the ideas that you are working on, even just as a researcher, or for a while I was chief of staff in the Democratic Alliance, and then eventually a member of parliament. But the ideas that you're putting forward are kind of contested, and there's a sort of cut and thrust of parliamentary debate is quite a fulfilling space to be in, particularly as a young person. There was a whole generation of us that got into politics quite young, and it was a really fulfilling time, particularly because the DA at that point was going from a relatively small party of opposition into government through the city, then the province. But one of the things that opened up was the opportunity in 2014, after that election, to then go into government. Spent some time working with the then mayor of Cape Town, Patricia de Lille, in her office, and then took over Wesgro. And at that point, Wesgro was, I think, 35 years old, one of the oldest agencies of its kind anywhere, really, with this mandate to promote tourism, trade, and investment for Cape Town and the Western Cape. And it's a really great brief, sitting at the intersection of government and business. And really making government more business friendly and helping business understand opportunity through the kind of public lens. So it requires a real unique skill set of being able to communicate to investors in the business community, but navigate the bureaucracy in government on their behalf and removing obstacles. And it all happens within the kind of marketing machine of positioning Cape Town and the Western Cape as a site for realizing opportunity. So I did that until I think I was there 6 years as CEO. And then for the last 2 years, I've been working as a consultant. I am a partner at a firm called Consulum. We run the Cape Town office, which is a very small office, a couple of us in Short Market Street. And basically, we do government advisory work around the world. My practice focuses in the economic development space, working with cities and regions and countries to help grow their global competitiveness. So we do a bunch of work around Southern Africa and particularly in the Middle East, and often translating some of the lessons from what we learned at Wesgro, and my colleagues have worked in other development boards in other countries around the world, and translating that into a set of best practices that aspirational, ambitious cities and regions and countries can adopt to accelerate growth. So it's a really interesting space to work in, particularly being able to do it from Cape Town, and with Cape Town remaining something of a laboratory for some of these ideas. The property investment that I do is really it's more like a hobby, but it came from some of the tough conversations we had through COVID around how to get the city centre going again. And a couple of us just thought, well, instead of lobbying and motivating and trying to fix marketing, what if we actually created some what we call lighthouse buildings by restoring some old heritage buildings back to life and back to a kind of a new life for an old building around some of the key nodes in the city. So that's a very small development company called Habitas.
That's awesome. I've seen some of the work that you guys are doing, and we'll get to that right now. I want to go back to your time and the transition from government to Wesgro. And I know Wesgro is a sort of, is it a quasi? It's not a private. It's a government.
It's a government
right?
agency.
But you were the CEO, and you had the responsibility to put strategic things in place, build a team, set goals. So much of our audience is entrepreneurial, and yes, it has a property focus, but property is becoming so much more. It is about running a business, and property's migrated towards brand, product, and running a brand and a business requires that sort of CEO mindset, I guess. Setting goals, raising investments, managing teams is a big thing. The world of property that I see at least is moving to this very like operational hands-on business. And I'd love to share a little bit about your journey at Wesgro as this new CEO who started there. Where did you even start? Like building a team, thinking about your strategic objectives. How did that journey start for you, and how would you possibly share some insights into your headspace in that process that other young entrepreneurs and CEOs in both private and the public sector, how would they take that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I referenced it earlier, the kind of long history of Wesgro. I mean, today I think it's 45 years old. So it's a really well-established brand, even though it's possibly not the most rational or logical name for an investment agency. People used to think we farmed apples or we were a fertilizer company. And we thought about rebranding, but there was so much equity behind the name because it's been around for so long that we stuck with it. And I think it's proven to be a good decision that, 4 decades of brand building is real, as you'll understand. It's a real thing. You kind of referenced the departure point for me as CEO, which was all about the team and the kinds of people we were getting into the team. It is a unique space, these agencies. So there are, every province, every city has versions of them. Wesgro's even more special because it's kind of like an umbrella agency. It encompasses the provincial and the city mandates across investment, tourism, exports. It's effectively the provincial film commission as well. So it really spans the whole economy and spans across tourism and economic interventions. And that's, I think, the sort of emerging best practice globally. Certainly, we're usually advising the investment boards we work with that they need to either align extremely closely with their destination marketing organizations or consider merging them, because essentially you're making the same argument to similar audiences around the world. We spoke about this a bit at the CCID event, the idea that a strong, or rather a tourist destination with a strong offer is starting down the road of positioning their economy for investment and growth, because in the end, investors are just people who vote with their feet, similar to tourists. So there's this kind of joined up effort now, certainly at Wesgro, between destination marketing and tourism promotion and economic promotion and investment. But when you're working across that space, you have the potential to hire a kind of unique individual who ideally has private sector experience, but wants to work in a space where they can make more of an impact. And because it's a government agency, are usually prepared to leave some money on the table in order to do that. But fortunately, I think with our generation, there are a lot of people that are motivated more by purpose than by financial motivations. And we were able to really do well going to some pretty big businesses and saying to the key staff there, listen, come and work in a space that is public, but not bureaucratic. So a lot of the people that joined us at Wesgro wouldn't have worked in a government department. They would have found it too stifling and bureaucratic. We were able to say you can have all the public impact, but we're going to minimize the bureaucracy and it's going to feel more like a private company. And what that meant is I think at the end, the vast majority of the exco had come from Standard Bank, British American Tobacco, Frost and Sullivan. We pulled in people from the private sector and put them into this public effort. And that was really the departure point for taking the agency to another level. After that, it's very stuff that's very familiar to you, Murray. It's about just setting a direction, being very clear around why the entity exists and why we get up in the morning, and then just letting those excellent people do their work.
Got you, 100% at a culture level.
Yep.
I feel like Wesgro has just done the most incredible job of building a brand. I don't know if it was an overnight success. It certainly felt like it when we moved to Cape Town, that Wesgro was something that just stood out to me as something that other cities, if they did it, they certainly didn't do it as well as Cape Town. And I think, you know, whether it's the accumulation of hard work from a number of really, you know, strong, incredibly talented people like yourself and the Mayor Jordan, and a massive amount of good people behind him, I feel like we are the beneficiary of that now. And you spoke so well at the CCID breakfast about the city, and the city is broken up into so many cool different neighborhoods that Neighborgood as a company is intrinsically invested in. Our mission really is to bring good to neighborhoods. And we operate in both Sea Point, Green Point, but most of our product and most of our members are actually across our buildings in the city. And you shared so much good about your thoughts on the city at that breakfast and how important it is to have a thriving CBD. We've obviously gone through a lot during COVID. You talked about your walk along St. George's Mall before COVID, and you felt like that at that time, in that moment, that as a city we had made it. Then everything turned on its head, and we've just been through, you know, a few years of very challenging times, I guess, and I guess we're going through the beginning stages of what recovery looks like. I'm excited for you to share a little bit about why you think the city is the heartbeat of the Western Cape, you know, and possibly even its impact on the whole of South Africa. Perhaps you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is about scarcity, right? I'm not sure there's another central city on the continent that is as functional and investable and frankly operates as a tourist destination in its own right as we have in Cape Town. So obviously most South Africans will know what's happened in our hometown, a real hollowing out of the central city with the momentum shifting out to the north coast. Similar story in Johannesburg, the momentum leaving the central city and moving to Sandton. And I think obviously one of the reasons why the CCID exists long before we were even here was because that was starting to happen in Cape Town towards Claremont, towards the southern suburbs. Obviously Century City was being built at that time. And the CCID formed as a partnership between government and business to fix the basics so that we could make the central city investable again. I think it's been a long history of success as an organization at the CCID. But what we were talking about at that business breakfast was what's next? What's the future? So I think it's an interesting conversation because of other cities around the continent that I think look to Cape Town as an example of success and can emulate that potentially. And it's just good economics to do that, right? If you think about our old hometown, the sheer asset base in the old central city, if you can just reactivate it, and I know there are investors that are busy and developers that are busy trying to do that, it's just a much more efficient transaction than keeping on expanding up the north coast. So preserving that asset base in Cape Town has been a big part of driving the efficiency of the city. And I think, as we discussed at the business breakfast, the future is recognizing that the beautiful thing about the SID model, the idea that your rates are automatically topped up, and that's going into cleaning and security and social work, and just creating a more investable environment. I was calling that, perhaps in a kind of unfair way, a passive mechanism, yes. Because as a building owner, as a landlord, it just happens. You can sit back, you pay for sure, but then after that, the work is done by the incredible teams at the CCID, and we just let it happen. The question now, I think, is in the future, we need to see particularly landlords, but also the city, also the provincial government, also investors and entrepreneurs lean in and take a more active stance. It's similar to the way you do as your company. Nobody sees Neighborgood as a kind of absent landlord with a big name on the door and a building that just works. They see you personally and your teams kind of at street level. You're worried about the surrounding areas. You're worried about the connective tissue between your building and other buildings. And I think it's because you see that improves the experience for your clients.
100%.
But it also generates better returns on your buildings. How do we get more landlords to take that active approach? Yeah. Not just top up the rates, which is, we're very generous, we're very grateful for. It's a very generous thing to do, but actually become more involved and active on street level. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we'll take. Firstly, we'll deal with some of the social issues in the CBD, which are still plentiful, but then take us into even further success. Mm-hmm. That active stance, particularly on behalf of landlords.
Got you. I think the cities, there's so many like spaces. There's definitely a strategic plan that I think, we've seen a lot of the macro planning that the city's done, that's been released for some time, I guess. So much of it is in the execution and actually just picking up your hand and getting it done. I think we moved up to Cape Town and at the end of 2019, and so much of the hard work is just execution and like ideas are one thing, but actually taking steps to, okay, this is what we're doing. How do we go about finding the best tenants who are not just tenants, but like a curated collection of experiences, underpinned by, community as a value, sustainability, and all of these things are really important in the world that we live in. You talked about lighthouses. I love that word, lighthouses, buildings as being lighthouses, like little beacons of light in the city. If there's a few hundred buildings in the city, maybe there's 30 or 40 lighthouses at the moment, I would say. I think our challenge as developers and people who have such a love for the city and so invested is to get that number, whatever the number is, and increase it to 40, 50, 60, 70% lighthouses across the city. So it can become this like thriving ecosystem that exists at night where people feel safe. In conversation with Cheryl, who runs OZC, she always talks about how important safety is to building community, and I definitely believe that as well. In an ideal world, the city would be completely thriving all day, all night, and you'd have restaurants and cafes at every level. And obviously, COVID has removed a lot of those people from the city for different reasons. People haven't necessarily come back to offices in the way that they were in the past. You, however, have seen opportunity in a building that you've bought in partnership with, I think, was it Brad Armitage? Be cool to share a little bit about that partnership and your part-time company. Sometimes part-time things become full-time things, by the way. So it'd be cool to understand a little bit about that transaction and about what you saw in the building and what your strategy is for it. Loop Street, there's a lot going on Loop Street. The Rawsons guys have done an amazing job building both the Carrington and the Tokyo, which have recently opened. There's a lot happening in Bree Street with the amazing restaurants and cafes. We have a really cool workspace there. We work on the corner of Strand Street. So there's a lot happening in the city. Tell us about that little building. I know you've got some amazing plans for it. There's a really cool cocktail bar on the bottom. You've purposely gone out and sought that tenant because there's a story around that. Maybe you can just take us through your thoughts and how that process went.
Okay. So yeah, another Durban guy, Brad Armitage, and I, and a third-party partner is Victoria Engelhorn, who's the founder of the Cape Heritage Hotel and that whole block on the corner of Bree and Short Market. She actually came up with this lighthouse idea, and her big focus, and I think we've kind of fully embraced it with our plans, is this idea of a central city being walkable. And the thing about the lighthouses is by people walking between them in a, as you say, a safe environment with lots of opportunity to transact and buy and shop and eat between the lighthouses. That's how you start building and strengthening the connective tissue in the city, and the whole city will rise behind that. That's the logic. That's the kind of stuff we were talking about in those dark days of COVID. Victoria actually hosted a meeting with a whole lot of people, the councillor, the sub-council chair, some high-profile residents, some business owners. Brad was there because he's started a bunch of businesses in Bree Street over the years. And we were just saying, well, the city had stopped. Everyone had left. It was a ghost town. We were thinking, well, what can we do to help bring it back? How can we support things like open streets and First Thursdays? And is there a way to marshal resources behind these initiatives that are going to bring people back to the CBD? And I think the legacy of that is there's been quite a strong resurgence led by the city and the CCID and all these initiatives. But we just suddenly thought, well, let's stop telling people about this idea of lighthouses and let's try and build a few. It really is a passion project because the economics are very modest relative to some of the impressive, like Rawson developments, for example, that you're mentioning. Our brief, the company is called Habitus. It's really like you say, a sort of part-time hobby. But the brief is, let's take some of the really beautiful old heritage buildings and bring them back to life. So we started with 108 Short Market, which was the old Africa Cafe. And it's a really beautiful building, 300 years old. And we've learned some hard lessons in terms of the cost of restoring heritage buildings and particularly the red tape, which I was always working on at Wesgro to try and cut the red tape, but now suddenly I was tied up in it myself. It was quite an interesting experience. But anyway, long story short, we've got Silk, an Asian tapas restaurant on the bottom. We've got Always Welcome, which is an extraordinary collective of designers, local designers who've filled the rest of the building. And there's a new restaurant coming on the rooftop in time for summer called Vista.
Mm.
But I think one of the things we talk about is for each of these buildings, let's try and bring something back that left the inner city. So you mentioned retailers leaving during COVID. I think the CCID numbers say 117 retailers left. And people know about the big ones like Patagonia left and Adidas left. And a lot of them went to the safety of the V&A. And when we look at what's available in the central city now, there's some big gaps, right? So design, Always Welcome, is bringing high-end South African design back to the CBD. So that was a tick for 108 Short Market. We give them a platform, give them a beautiful, unique building, which they've done out in an extraordinary fashion. And we say, now the building's alive, it's become a lighthouse, and we've brought design back to the CBD. Then moving down to Loop Street, a lot of our logic, by the way, flows from Bree just being an extraordinary success as a street. But if Bree is succeeding and probably quite fully priced, what's happening one street down? Similar to what the Rawson guys have seen. So we acquired 61 and 63 Loop Street. 63 is that cute little building. It used to have a Yours Truly in it. We bought it from Dan. And as you say, we've got some Japanese-American investors coming in there with, I think, a cocktail bar that's going to redefine that experience for South Africans. I've been to some of their bars in New York, and it really is extraordinary. They're going to open in November. And then next door at 61 Loop, we thought one of the things we lost was wellness and yoga and Pilates. So we've taken that old building, and actually this weekend we're opening Habitus Wellness, which is 2 yoga studios, a Pilates studio, some treatment rooms, and taking a similar approach to what Victoria's done at Heritage Square, and trying to build a community around that, in the same way that you do at Neighborhood. So there's Yebo Baba, what Mteta calls Cape Town's first township coffee brand on the ground floor. Got some other of our friends from Durban at Talking to Strangers. Next door to him, we've got an exhibition space at the back. And then when you move up through the building, you're suddenly in this wellness space. And there's a couple more floors above that we're going to activate in the future. So creating a fluid, collaborative feel in the building, but within the constraints of this really beautiful old heritage building. And I think in that way, creating another lighthouse in that corner, which in itself is turning around quite rapidly. And I think if we can do that, then the question is what's happening in Loop and St. George's and Adderley. And I think those lighthouses between the lighthouses that you build at Neighborhood and some of the other developers and what we're up to, hopefully the investment can help drive the very clear vision of the CCID to bring the CBD back to a position that's much stronger than hopefully where we even were before COVID.
Got you. I want to go back to the Loop Street transaction, just because you and I share a very similar thought process when it comes to curating these experiences and defining a personality for a building. Because I think buildings for so long, and this is a macro problem that exists globally, big property landlords tend to be fairly removed from the streets. They are good at asset management and good at understanding numbers. But in this post-COVID world that we live in, buildings really do require that personality. And I'm quite excited about developers that exist in the city that are really bringing that personality through, just the way you described your building now. There's like clear design in your mind and in your partner's minds that have come and filtered through the building, which is absolutely where the future is. Easier said than done, though, because the economics for these things to work, the economics in time need to work as well. It doesn't have to shoot the lights out. It just needs to make ends meet, I guess, and everyone can do fairly well. The structuring of the deals has been an interesting thing for me, because people forget how important the ground floor of a building is. The composite of buildings these days, and definitely for the future, and depending on the context of each asset, is definitely mixed use. So the best developers in the world, within our category, I guess, are building these insanely cool mixed use ecosystems, and not with every category and every building. It's, is design absent? Tick. Okay, cool. We're not going to do the same thing in the next building, but we'll create a personality for that building in the next building. But there's creative deal structuring that needs to happen to even get tenants in. A lot of the way we've done things is to try and remove the barrier to entry entirely and put people on, very structured, low-based turnover deals, with the understanding that having them there is more important to the city, to the whole building, than not having them there. In the past, pre-COVID, possibly 10, 20 years ago, it would just be, here's your rental, let's just call it 350 Rand a square meter, plus your turnover clause. You get a standard TI in your deal, and take it or leave it. You would probably be dealing with a property manager. So you would probably be twice removed from the landlord who owns 500, 600 buildings. Now I'm picking up the phone and finding those people and meeting them and courting them and walking the streets, and it's just super important to the future. Did you guys have to go through that process? How did you go about finding that balance for the incredible tenants you now have and those customers who make up the composite of your building? Did you have to go through a process without sharing too much detail? How did you arrive at deals that made sense for them, given the context of the CBD now is quite a challenged one? You had to sell that story. How did you go about finding that equilibrium with the tenants that you brought into the building in a way that also worked for you?
I think the answer to the question actually is it flows from Cape Town's kind of unique appeal as a place that attracts interesting people from around the continent and the world. It really sucks in talent, and it sucks in a very interesting type of talent, right? So, Victoria is half German, half Spanish. She moved to South Africa, I think, a couple decades ago, and she could live. She's a proper citizen of the world. She could live anywhere, but she chooses to live here. In the same way, we've made our way here from Durban. My other colleague, Brad, made our way here from Durban. And people arrive with quite a strong hinterland and a backstory and a network. And that's one of the reasons why I think Cape Town is such a creative capital and such an innovative city in terms of tech, for example, and renewable energy. It's really embracing skills and talents and brains from other places that come in with new and different ideas. And I don't think that happens in a more real way than in the central city. So in terms of our really modest developments, the tenants are coming from the very different networks that Brad, myself, and Victoria have. Brad has a history of building some of the most exciting South African brands from scratch. And he's got a huge network across the creative industries. Victoria's got a huge global network. I understand a little bit about how the public sector interacts with business. And between that, I think we've managed to originate some pretty interesting clients that maybe wouldn't normally have looked at the CBD as an option. But again, we're playing into a strength that Cape Town has. I mean, the thing that fires me up every day walking around the central city is the mix of tourists and locals. This idea of a central city as a tourist destination is quite an interesting one. Certainly, it's quite novel. I think a lot of people in other South African cities would never advise a tourist to go to the central city. But we've got the Red Bus, which is connecting all of the tourist sites around Cape Town, operating from possibly the most central point of the central city. It's not to say there aren't issues around, Green Market Square where they're located. But there's enough dynamism and enough investment and enough footfall between the locals and the tourists to, I think, drive a strong resurgence. Like you say, it's unlikely to be, a couple of decades ago, Old Mutual would take a block and there would be thousands of employees in there. That's obviously, those days are gone, but maybe with smaller offices, with entrepreneurs, with global companies setting up offices in the central city, you're going to keep building on that strength of the central city as a melting pot. And when those ideas collide, that's when the innovation that we're now becoming famous for happens.
Got you. I want to go back to what you're talking about, tourism, because you are now for your sins, you are the chairman of SA Tourism, which in itself is insane. It's a really cool position that has a big weight on your shoulders. Obviously, South Africans have seen what you've done with Wesgro, which is really exciting. So I am super excited about what I think you personally are capable of with Patricia de Lille driving tourism. It's just such a big part of Cape Town's future. We are lucky as a province that we are a benefactor of such a big tourism industry that we now see coming back after COVID. It's obviously super important to the property industry as well, because short-term rental properties, hotels, which really have come off a difficult couple of years from March 2020 onwards, are now seeing the pickup that I don't think we're just back to 2019 levels, but we're certainly on the way. Tell us about how important tourism is to the province and to the property sector.
I think it's in a country that's experiencing lots of growth constraints and lots of difficult issues politically, financially. Tourism is the one thing that can drive jobs and drive a recovery very, very quickly. That's certainly one of the things that motivates us at South African Tourism. The product is great across the country. South African Tourism has a history of being a really effective destination marketing organization, and we're working with the management team to get back to that point quickly and take the message out to the world of the unique experiences that we offer as a country. I obviously for Cape Town and the Western Cape, tourism is one of our biggest sectors. I also think, as I alluded to earlier, it's been the driver of a lot of our investment success, because investment these days is driven by talent. We worked with the team at Amazon over a decade to build out their investment here, and they always told us that their logic for Cape Town was about talent, tapping into developers from UCT, Stellenbosch, CPUT, but then also being able to attract talent from the rest of the continent to relocate to Cape Town. And if you think about the reasons for that relocation, the fact that people are prepared to move here, it's the lifestyle, it's the natural beauty, it's the quality of life in the city. So in that way, tourism kind of has impact even beyond itself, even beyond the money that you can bring in off the back of an individual tourist. It kind of builds out the investment case, particularly for a city like Cape Town. And I think, as I said earlier, it's going to be probably the biggest driver of recovery of the CBD, provided we can keep the CBD on the list as one of the top places to visit as a tourist when you visit South Africa.
Got you. Also completely share your opinion there. As a company, we believe that doing good is good for business. It's in our name. We believe it. We wake up every day thinking about it. It's part of our culture. Do you have a story of a person or a company that you think is worth sharing that speaks to that word good and bringing good to the world?
Oh, wow. I think if we're honest, one of the challenges of the Cape Town CBD is managing the huge diversity of of users of the city space. David Green, who's the CEO of the V&A, is a very good friend, and he's influenced a lot of my thinking about this. And he says the secret to placemaking is understanding what your users need. So not your landlords, actually, not your investors, the people that use the city every day. And I think he's absolutely spot on with that. Now, we have as much as I'm talking about a kind of cosmopolitan mix in the city center, the other way to understand that is we have a huge diversity of different kinds of people from different economic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds using the city. And I think too often we kind of sit in our own patches and cater to our own markets. And I think it's really exciting when you have entrepreneurs and businesses that try and break down those barriers. And a very cool one who I know has worked a lot with Rob at Boxwood is David Sedgwick with the Happy Hippo. I think when you talk to David about his vision for that coffee shop, there's lots of coffee shops in the central city. He said, well, what I wanted to do was say, how do I provide a service offering that every user in the city can afford? There's something for anyone, whether you're arriving from Langa on a minibus taxi, whether you've flown in your private jet from Europe, you can go to Happy Hippo and there's something for you.
That's so awesome.
I think it's just a really cool, inspiring vision that probably shows a path towards some of the challenging integration stuff we need to do between communities in the central city. So even you and I did a walk the other day through some of the big old banking buildings that our friend Christian Ellick has acquired along Adderley Streets and St. George's. That's an extraordinary asset base. I think he's up to 30,000 square meters across all of those buildings. And then you've got another German, Christian Benzing, who's done something similar with some of the old Long Street buildings. And it's great to have that investment coming in from Europe. But if those nodes, Adderley and St. George's and Long, are going to come back strongly, they're going to have to grapple with some of these integration issues. And maybe what David and Rob have done with Happy Hippo is a kind of indication of how you can start to think about that. Small, but eventually at scale, to kind of leverage the city as a place where cultures integrate.
Absolutely love that. Finally, what sort of advice? You still look like you're about 28 years old, even though you have gray hair. You're doing something. Obviously, a lot of yoga in your building. But I want to know, looking back, what advice would you give your 21-year-old self? I would consider you someone who's quite wise when I hear you speak. And I'd love to, like, upon reflection and everything that you've been through, and I'm sure you've got so much to achieve still, what advice would you give yourself?
I think, so when I was 21, I was at Vastia and I was about to go and work for Standard Bank in Joburg. And there were probably two things I was thinking, one of which I didn't do and one that I did do. And I would probably advise myself to think about those slightly differently. So I remember having a conversation with my manager at Standard Bank. Now that I was earning a salary for the first time, I started looking at property actually and thinking what property could I buy? And I never pulled the trigger. Eventually, sort of a couple years later in a different career, I did. But I think I really regret not doing that at the time. We spoke about it and I just never did it. But as soon as I had a reliable income, it was a chance to raise some money, get a bond and start getting on the property ladder. And I should have. I think it would have made a very big impact over the years since then. So that's advice that I would have given myself to actually pull the trigger.
Start earlier.
Exactly, yeah. As soon as you have some reliable income, then you're credit worthy. The other one was around travel, actually. I know a lot of younger people, there's a lot of pressure on you, and a lot of people have a lot of dependence and they're paying off student loans and they you get a lot of responsibility quickly as a young person trying to build a career. But certainly the most valuable things, even for my career, were the times when I went off and took sabbaticals or left a job, perhaps when people were quite surprised that I was doing that, and then went traveling. And there's a period in your life between education and when you usually settle down and get more financial and emotional obligations, where you can be more footloose. And my advice to anybody at that stage is just don't miss those opportunities to see the world, because those experiences, those travel experiences, have really informed everything that I've done in work and business in a very productive way, as well as being a lot of fun. That's actually where you realize where the opportunities in work are as well.
That's amazing.
And I think too many people get through that period of their lives and say, well, one day I'm going to do this, and they never do it. And then certainly when you get to our stage with kids, it does get harder. Obviously, you can still travel, but there's nothing like that kind of footloose travel that you can do in that period.
Tim, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege having you on. Thank you for your insight, for everything that you're doing for the city. I'm just really excited to see the next chapter of your journey, both in the public sector and in the private sector, and just as a mate as well. Thank you for being on.
Thanks a lot, Murray.
Thanks.